to see you all. And as mentioned, tonight's topic is a Christian response to the new atheism. It was the only topic at the time that interested me for a master's thesis, and it was successful. I was going to do a whole defence of Christianity, and my supervisor said, "Don't do that." He said, you'll never finish the thing. So he said, concentrate on the underlying assumptions of the new atheism. So I said, good. That makes it easy. And it's also related to philosophy, the underlying assumptions. These three books, some of you will be familiar with. Of course, Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig, you know, most of you. Reasonable Atheism is a book I found just before I did the thesis, and I was absolutely quite fascinated by it. The two guys who wrote it, Reasonable Atheism sounds like a response to Reasonable Faith, but it's by two atheist philosophers. They're professional philosophers. They are atheists, and I drew a lot from them. The one thing I wanted to do in this thesis was not to whitewash a Christian response to atheism, but to give them several thousand words where I let them have their say. Okay, so let us proceed, shall we? There's my thesis. So I took it from there. So the question is I was looking at, is religious faith reasonable? Many people today have grown suspicious over religion. Religious faith, especially as seen in the news today, is seen as, by many people, as something to be wary about. Fanaticism, terrorism, extremism, fundamentalism, those words don't have good press, as we know. Many feel that religious faith breeds intolerance toward others, and Sam Harris in The New Atheism is very vocal about that. Fanatical acts in the name of the religion have produced terror and threatened the well-being of society, and Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, was very vocal about that. So the difficulty with religion, certainly from a philosophical viewpoint, the problem is God remains hidden. I deal with that in my thesis, but I didn't have time to add everything into it tonight. God remains hidden. We're asked to believe without evidence. We are to trust without certainty. Science offers objective evidence. It makes an objective case. Yet many feel religion only offers subjective hope. Science seems to make the stronger case. Now, in pre-modern times, many people, as we know, believed in God, angels, demons. It was almost impossible not to believe in God in pre-modern times. One of the reasons when modernity came, the Age of Enlightenment, etc., one of the reasons people adhered to a scientific view is because they began to encounter that science made the better case. And even if they wanted to hold on to the belief in God, angels and demons, they felt they had to let it go because science was so compulsory in what it was saying. Charles Taylor, in his excellent but mammoth book, The Secular Age, does a wonderful presentation of that case. But, yeah. So the two towering worldviews, inspired by Lord of the Rings, the two towering worldviews that has arisen, science giving objective evidence about the world, religion giving subjective hope and understanding, supernaturalism and naturalism. They're the two towering worldviews of the West. Naturalism believes that the universe is all there is and it's all that has existed. Supernaturalism, as we know, believes in that there is a God, a creative, infinite, personal God beyond the universe. Naturalism believes the universe is all there ever is. Supernaturalism believes there is a being beyond what we can see in the universe. I'll just go quickly through this. So the naturalistic worldview rests upon the belief that the material universe is the total sum of reality. What you see is what you get, and there's nothing beyond it. Naturalism normally assumes that always existing matter has developed into the ordered universe we see by a blind, timeless process of chance. The human being, as one part of the natural universe, is also the result of that matter, time and chance. Within the context of the naturalistic worldview, miracles as such do not exist. They're natural events which at the moment don't have an explanation. So for the naturalists, there is no supernatural explanation. There is no supernatural safety net underneath their thinking. Naturalism, and this is why many people felt they had to give up a view of God, naturalism stands on what is seen, on what the evidence supports. Science has provided us with the appropriate tools to assess the evidence. Now, if people stand on what is presented them with, evidence, you can't be stupid for believing it, because there's the evidence. The most common expressions of naturalism have been attempts to work out consistent accounts of all our knowledge about the world, which of course is the process of philosophy through the generations, has been to try and get an overall ordered explanation. Especially in the light of evolutionary aspects of the natural and human world brought to the fore in the 19th century geology, biology, history and psychology. Those type of things began to sway a whole Western mindset away from the belief in God. Not that people didn't believe in God, but there appeared to be more evidence that science was saying. Yeah, that's what I said. Belief in the supernatural existed before the days of science, before the Age of Enlightenment, sought to use reason and rationality to develop an accurate view of the world. That's what they're after, an accurate view. Belief in the supernatural held to the existence of gods and angels and demons, which science had relegated to the place of legends, myths, superstition. The phrases myth and superstition figure heavily in the thinking of the new atheist, because they're going off the first bit. Now, you might know, you've surely heard of Anthony Flew, one of the most famous atheists. He went to Oxford the same time as C.S. Lewis. I've heard him speak against God in one of his talks, and he thundered with indignation that anyone could believe in God. But he had one principle that one of his mentors taught him, and the principle was always follow where the evidence leads. That was his principle. But Anthony Flew had for many decades a great influence on the world of atheism, and he had the famous presumption of atheism. No evidence, no God. Right? If there is a God, we must have grounds, he said, for that belief. But if no such grounds are provided, there exists no sufficient reason for believing in God. No sufficient reason with no sufficient grounds. The only reasonable position is to be a negative atheist or an agnostic, and he clarifies that there. So he was driven to that conclusion by what he felt was no sufficient evidence. He said he's willing to go with the evidence led, but he saw no sufficient evidence to follow. And this was a guy who was a contemporary with C.S. Lewis. When C.S. Lewis had his great debate with Elizabeth Larcombe or something, and they're walking back across the bridge, Anthony Flew was right behind them, listening, you know. Anyway, pretty
so Bruce, what was his specialty? What was he a professor of, you know?
He was professor of philosophy.
Philosophy,
yeah, and he wrote heaps of philosophy books. So the growing concern hitting the culture, hitting the mindset of many people, is that if the naturalist is correct and there is no God or supernatural aspect of the universe, then on what grounds do religious believers hold that God exists? If the naturalist is correct and there is no God, on what grounds do the supernaturalists hold that God exists?
Well, the big if, isn't it? Because, you know, we've had many a night putting forward the notion that, in fact, there is naturalistic evidence that doesn't prove conclusively, but certainly makes it reasonable to believe there is a God.
And that's right, and we might look at that as we go through, because so if religious people, if their actions are being influenced by a God who is not there, then what is really influencing? This is the great thought that nags at the understanding of the new atheists. This is what really nags at their thinking. What is influencing them if there is no God? Where's all this coming from? To the naturalist and Richard Dawkins, religion must be a man-made phenomenon. It has to be. Dawkins, Hitchens would say if there is no God, then it has to be man-made. And these people, he said, those poor fundamentalists, Dawkins says, think of what they're missing out on because they refuse to look to where the evidence is pointing. The supernaturalists say, but Richard, it's pointing in the other direction. But we'll continue on. Before the rise of the new atheists, Bertrand Russell, as you know, wrote the book Why I'm Not a Christian. He came out and said, and this is the great complaint of atheists, religious people do not listen to the evidence. That's their complaint. He said the attitude that one ought to believe such and such a proposition, independently of whether there's any evidence for it, is an attitude he felt which produces hostility to evidence and causes us to close our minds to every fact that doesn't suit our prejudice. That's what he's saying the religious mindset creates. So this is the irrational problem of all religious faith that it presents to the thinking person. Religion then is simply a disease born of fear and a source of untold misery to the human race. It is fear, pure and simple, he said. This is Bertrand Russell, famous atheist. Fear, pure and simple, he believed that was the foundation for religion. Fear stands as the parent of cruelty, and therefore it is no wonder if cruelty and religion have gone hand in hand. Now, they're not just talking about Christianity, they're talking the whole spectrum. But as we said, their concern is there's no evidence for the God, they say, that these people believe in. So it has to be man-made, therefore it has to be rising out of fear. People wanting control over other human beings. That's where they're coming from. Now, the atheist world, as I researched, we know it's been going on for a long time. They published their books on atheism, but it wasn't a large readership. Back in the early days, the genre for atheist books wasn't widely known and published. They had their conventions, but they were in-house. So Russell said the root cause is by declaring that religious people alone have unchanging truth, they become opponents to all the intellectual and moral progress. How so? Because they will not listen to any evidence. This is their view. And then things changed. In 2006, things began to change. 4 horsemen came riding internationally across the world scene. From Indonesia, from America, from England to Australia, wherever you think of. The next one. These men started to make a worldwide impact. Their books became #1 bestsellers on the New York Times list. There was even a show, you know, The Vicar of Dibley? There was a comedian, some show like that, 2 old guys in their room talking about God and religion. One guy says, "Oh, you don't believe in that, do you?" And this is a comedy on TV. He goes and gets the book of the God Delusion and said, let's consult our friend Dawkins. I went to one shop in Colonnades at Noarlunga, a family shop, you know. There's a whole stack, ready for Christmas, a whole stack of the God Delusion delusion just full on, right? In Malaysia they're studying, in Indonesia, the God delusion of itself, and with these guys, created a whole new publishing genre, a whole new publishing world for atheist books. Conventions which weren't going public, they just sprung up. Nicky Gumbel from Alpha fame over in England, he went to a debate and Richard Dawkins was there, and he turned up and there was about 4,000 people there. He said, which is amazing that the interest was happening, the interest. So there they are. They're the books that changed the world from 2006. This one, of course, Breaking the Spell with Daniel Dennett, God is Not Great, Christopher Hitchens. This one is quite a strong word to the Christian believers. End of Faith is there, and that's all those together. They changed the world from 2006 as far as atheism, religion and philosophy, etc. So their concerns about faith and reason aren't the usual concerns of the philosopher. Which one has the more justified true belief, faith or reason? For the atheists, they're not there. The new atheists are not discussing philosophical perspectives when they speak of faith as compared to reason. To the new atheist, there is no discussion. Reason is the only rational option. Religious faith, they feel, has no rationality whatsoever. So faith is not even, for the new atheist, faith is not even in the question. It's irrational. It's myth and it's superstition, and worse than that, it impedes the progress of the human race. Therefore, all religious faith is ill-founded and hinders true human progress. This is in the thought and in the passion of the new atheism. So, as Richard Dawkins said, and I pulled out, the new atheists then have a high calling to society. To call society to a return to rationalism and reason. Let's get rid of this supernatural faith for which there is no evidence. So they say. A call to the return to the foundations of modernity. A call to rid the world of all religions, declaring them to be simply man-made myths and superstition. And that's the difference between the new atheism and the Bertrand Russell old atheism. These new guys, the Four Horsemen and their followers, are militant atheists. Early atheists said, oh look, I don't believe in God, but they can do what they want. These guys are different. They want the extinction of all religious belief everywhere. And Dawkins, as we know, is very passionate about it.
He's not the best writer for them, though. He's not the best apostle for them because, I mean, I know a strong intellectual atheist who read the book and then questioned her atheism at the end of it because it was so clearly beat up propaganda that it made her look again at the question of religion, you know?
Yeah, and that's what it's...
Lots of criticism.
Yeah, that's what I'll look at that as we go. So the principles of the new atheist, the Bible and all sacred texts are not a source of morality. Religion deserves no special treatment or respect within society. There was one political guy in London who wanted all religious people banned from the public marketplace because of where they're coming from, you know, superstitious stuff. They hold this, as we've seen, there's no supernatural element to the universe, and they're very affirmative in atheism is a positive philosophy producing happier, progressive societies that are not crippled by religious superstitions. That is part of the high calling of the new atheists, to get this into society again. Indeed, without evidence, faith, they hold, is a human tragedy. Sorry about that. The new atheists believe they can provide inescapable reasons why belief in God should be considered as a subhuman endeavour. Okay. So they are militant. They are really against religion. a subhuman endeavour of rational human beings, spearheading a deconstruction of faith and belief and anything that smacks of the divine. Their task is clear: eliminate and rid the world of the persuasive mental and emotional delusion that still afflicts people with a belief in God. So these are the words of militant atheism. And why is this so? Because in their view, faith conveys no knowledge. Knowledge in the philosophical sense of having true, justified beliefs. We'll look at this a little later. The New Atheists try to declare faith does not consist of true belief, and that far from conveying actual knowledge, subjective or otherwise, faith in all things religious is a harbinger of irrationality and so poses a danger to the human condition. To base knowledge on anything other than science and rationality, they assert, is to steer society and culture toward ignorance and superstition. That's where the new atheists are coming from. Now, many people may be somewhat disturbed by the popularity of this kind of thinking. As I said, it went all around. Sam Harris affirms, he was very vitriolic, every religion preaches the truth of propositions for which it has no evidence. In fact, every religion preaches the truth of propositions for which no evidence is even conceivable. Now, if you have this mindset, how do you view religion? If that's your thinking, how would you view it? Again, Harris asserts, we convince ourselves that our beliefs can float entirely free of reason and evidence. This is their thinking, this is their mentality. Dawkins sums up religion, Richard Dawkins. The whole point of religious faith, its strength and chief glory, is that it does not depend on rational justification. That's its whole strength, he feels, and its chief glory. There was one preacher who said, of course religion is based on faith and not knowledge, and Richard Dawkins heard about that. He said, look at it, can you believe it, he says. He was most unimpressed. Then its frustration is because many people, believers, appear happy to regard their tenets of faith as simply non-discussable, not debatable, not negotiable, simply because it is the Word of God or the Bible says so. He said, look, that kind of closed-off aspect makes it impossible for us to take them seriously. There's no engagement, as we'll look on further on. That's what they feel, no engagement. Of course, Sam Harris has to judge in there too. Religious judgment of others may be due to the overweening confidence with which the religious assert minute details for which they neither have nor could have any evidence. Perhaps it is the very fact that there is no evidence to support theological opinions, either way, that fosters the characteristic draconian hostility toward those of slightly different opinions. I don't think they have slightly different opinions, but he liked to think his opinions are slight. So, the source of their passion, because as you probably know, Richard Dawkins has been called an evangelist for the New Atheist position. The source, religion is a problem. Any religion, all religion, religion in all its irrational, fanatical forms is now the clear and present danger for humanity. Not only is it, they believe, a throwback to a more primitive and unenlightened time, but they assert that the trigger finger of religious fanaticism now poses a threat that no rational person could ignore. And I have to perhaps add that many people looking at the news reports today would tend to agree with that. I worked with a guy since left, and he said, religion is the problem. He said, it's the big problem of the whole world. This girl at work, she thinks she hears from God. Can you believe it? She thinks she hears from God. So there's a huge secular divide. So what is the event, as we move on and march on, what is the event that launched this new atheism? There was a crucial event that happened that brought it all into being. That's it. That was the living evidence that convinced them beyond any shadow of a doubt that religion is dangerous. Which many would understand. Next one, if we will. There was an article written in a German paper, 2007. What the new atheists have in common is the traumatic experience of September 11. Without the attacks of New York on Washington in 2001, the new atheism probably would not exist. Exactly one day after the attack, Sam Harris began writing a book. So their fears, this build-up of fears about religion, no evidence, superstitious stuff, 9/11 just convinced them they were right, and they just got into action. And Dawkins said, my last vestige of hands-off religion, respect, disappeared in the smoke and choking dust of September 11, 2001. And he said it was followed by a national day of prayer, which prelates and pastors did to, Martin King impersonation, and urged people of mutually incompatible faiths to hold hands, united in homage to the very force that he felt caused the problem in the first place. So as you can hear in the mindset, the headspace of the new atheist, it is pure naturalism. There is no supernatural, and all this religious stuff is a wild card of danger to society. It's the wild card you'll never be sure when you see coming. And so hence the great the call for tolerance in our society. Watch those people, you've got to have tolerance, they'll set a bomb under your car or something. So 9/11 convinced the new atheists that the cost of religion was too high. Dennis said, in the adult world of religion, people are dying and killing. Moderates cowered into silence. Harris said, faith inspires violence. People often kill other human beings because they believe the Creator wants them to, etc. And Dawkins said, absolutism nearly always results in strong religious faith, and it constitutes a major reason for suggesting that religion can be a force in the world. See, it mentions the moderates cowed into silence. There was a report on the YouTube, there was this lady, it wasn't the United Nations, they were dealing with some concern in a third world country or something. It was a conference in America, and one girl put up her hand and said, oh, but there's many moderate Muslims in America. And this lady said, I'm glad you raised that. She said, and she went through China, 9/11, she went through a whole lot of different terrorism strikes, and she said it only took up to 25 radicals to do this, and she went through every world, several situations that have been reported in the news, and she said the moderates were irrelevant. Every one of the moderates were irrelevant. The moderates were irrelevant. And actually saying the moderates cowered into silence. She said, all your other moderates, they should be here in this meeting. So she said they're irrelevant. So she didn't let her get away with that. Yeah. And that's really what it's saying. But there's hope. Dawkins is willing to show a better way. Many atheists have said this better than me, and the knowledge we have only for one life should make it all the more precious. The atheist way is correspondingly life-affirming, life-enhancing, while at the same time never being tainted with self-delusion, wishful thinking, or the whinging self-pity of those who feel life owes them something. So Dawkins takes the high moral ground. Okay. Hitchens affirms that view. He said, look, we secular humanists and atheists and agnostics do not wish to deprive humanity of the least of its wonders and consolations, not in the least. But he affirms that it's through the lens of science, naturalism, that we can find that appreciation of things that are awesome, mysterious, and beautiful. But others would say they found outside of science an appreciation of things that are awesome, mysterious and beautiful. So as we move along, Dawkins said, atheism then offers a fulfilling way of life devoid of meaningless, unsubstantiated claims to the existence of God. He offers practical advice for those who turn away from religion by saying, if the demise of God leaves a gap in your life, different people will fill it in different ways. He said, my way includes a good dose of science, the honest and systematic endeavour to find out the truth about the real world. That's his recipe. Now, Becky Garrison, she's a reporter. She's a Christian. She interviewed this Meta guy who is an atheist. And he said, these guys, they're very gung-ho, but they are tapping into a belief that many people hold. So it's not just the Four Horsemen. But it's a view that many people have rarely wanted to say out loud. Atheism, he felt, does make the most realistic reflection of life. Religion is nonsense, he feels. There is no denying that these authors have come out swinging, and many non-religious people are glad to have someone finally saying what they've felt for a long time. Hence the popularity of their books. Okay. And that's the book I mentioned, Aiken and Pallassi, Professional Philosophers. We'll look at it a little more as we come to a conclusion on this. I enjoyed that book because they actually know what they're doing. And they said, we actually felt sorry for the ontological argument, that the way that Richard Dawkins just went. He said, the ontological argument, as an example, has had philosophers and theologians thinking about it for centuries, and it deserves more respect than just to be treated like it's rubbish, because they're trained philosophers, they know the value of that. And even though they agree with what they're saying, they doubt that their approach will prove terribly fruitful. The strategy of the new atheists. The new atheists don't seriously respond to any objection to their views. They dismiss them out of hand, as we mentioned earlier. These two philosophers see this as a special tactic, which they call no reasonable opposition. The new atheists do not listen to any opposition. They regard that any opposition to their view is not reasonable.
We've met a few people like that, even among us sometimes.
Well, that's what they call it, a no reasonable opposition. Anything you have to say against our beliefs we regard as rubbish. This is the approach where one decides that the opponents are not simply wrong, but ignorant, idiotic and depraved. So why would you listen to anything such people have to say? It is where one party has taken the view there is simply no reasonable opposition that can be mounted against their views, and that all opposition is woefully informed, ignorant, irrational. Indeed, those who disagree with you are not even worth speaking to. Now, am I wrong or perhaps correct that that kind of attitude could be described as pride? Anything who disagrees with you, anyone who disagrees with you, is either stupid, deluded, or worse.
Or militant.
Yes.
Militant attitude.
Yeah.
Good start on it.
Yeah, I was just thinking, you know what, that there's people like that in every group, including the community of faith.
That's right, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. This is an example when Dawkins used that no reasonable opposition approach. They said, but Professor Dawkins, what experience do you have in theology to speak to these issues? And he says, I have, of course, met this point before. It sounds superficially fair, but it presupposes that there is something in theology to be ignorant about. The entire thrust of my position is that Christian theology is a non-subject. It is empty, vacuous, devoid of coherence or content. There be many theologians who might like to have a bit of a word with Professor Dawkins. I did quote in my thesis Keith Ward. He's written some books. Is Christianity rational? You know, does God exist? And he had a bit of a gorgeous dig at Richard Dawkins. He said it's well known that everyone who comes from Oxford doesn't know anything about, doesn't know much about anything. And Richard Dawkins came from Oxford and actually proved the point, something like that. So, the new atheist grave disservice to religion. Some of you may know the atheist scholar Michael Roos, perhaps. Now, as an atheist, he's responding. Their treatment of the religious viewpoint is pathetic to the point of non-being. Richard Dawkins and the God delusion would fail any introductory or religion course. Proudly he criticises that whereof he knows nothing. If we criticise gene theory with as little knowledge as Dawkins has as a religion and philosophy, he would rightly be indignant. But he's not indignant if we criticise him because he won't accept any reasonable opposition to his view. Neither will the other guys. Roos again. Unlike the new atheists, I take scholarship seriously. I have written that the God delusion made me ashamed to be an atheist, and I meant it. Trying to understand how God could need no cause, Christians claim that God exists necessarily. I have taken the effort to try and understand what that means. Dawkins and company are ignorant of such claims and positively contemptuous of those who even try to understand them, let alone believe them. So the new atheists are definitely militant. And he said there are a lot of very bright and well-informed Christian theologians. We atheists should demand no less. So if they're going to write about it, he expects atheist scholars to be well-informed. Now, our heroes, or those who contribute well, they said, look, if the aim is to expose religious belief as silly or poisonous and to call out religious believers as idiots, the new atheists, and these guys are atheists, need to show that the most serious and compelling arguments for religious belief fail. The new atheists need to show that. It's easy to knock down weak arguments for religious belief, but there's no achievement in pinning down the amateurs to the canvas. What counts is how well one can do against the pros. And it's the professionals that the new atheist didn't talk to, at least not yet. And then came into the fray the Knights of the Lord's Table. I made that up. Mark Worthing said, oh, I like that. You know, as we know, John... Thank you. Alistair McGrath, who was an atheist and really poo-pooed religion, he got into philosophy and poo-pooed that. Then he looked closer at philosophy and said, hey, this has actually got something to contribute. He became a Christian. Christopher Hitchens' brother, Peter Hitchens, yeah, and of course, William Lane Craig. And there's others, of course, but I had to get 4 nights and I got photos where they're all... Okay, yeah. And so in response to this, these were main books speaking to the rise of the new atheists. Alistair McGrath, I believe his wife, Joanna, they wrote the first one. He's since written another, even wider one. Reasonable Faith, John Lennox, that's a really good one against the new atheists, up to date, 2011. And of course, Peter Hitchens' book. He said, my brother Christopher, he said, he just won't listen to anything and it makes his views insufferable. But as we know, I think 2011, something like that, Christopher Hitchens died of throat cancer around that time. There are many other books. In my thesis, I said, oh, well, I've looked at all the main atheist books. I'll look at the Christian books. I had most of them. I was writing for 3 weeks to try and catch up 6 years of Christian books. Most of them did not make the New York bestseller times. One did, What's So Great About Christianity by Dino De Souza. That made it. No, I can't place the other one. Anyway, these began to lead a huge Christian library speaking to the new atheism. Small books, little books, big books, whatever. Now, it was said, a veritable army of Christian theists and philosophers literally produced a small library of books, sell out debates across the US and England, and McGrath, Lennox and Craig were prominent participants in these debates with the new atheists. Yep. So there's John Lennox talking to Richard Dawkins. They actually got on well. When Christopher Hitchens' book came out, he asked his publishers to set up some good debates for him, not weird debates, but good ones. And he did debate a number of Christian scholars, as we know. And they actually quite enjoyed him, and he did express his appreciation for how well and how courteously he was treated by the Christian scholars. He did appreciate that. The Lennox ones, as you know, they're available at Koorong, and this is just a sample of the various debates that were held. So the accusation that the new atheists avoided engaging with scholars did change a bit with this. They did come out and engage. When he was talking to John Lennox, I believe, in a debate in London, Does God Exist? Richard Dawkins was most magnanimous. He said, yes, I suppose I've given the impression that I don't believe Jesus existed. I take that back. He did exist. But he would have been far too intelligent to believe in God. So he got halfway. The great irony, the new atheists employed a no reasonable opposition response to religion in their books, yet their books actually renewed a worldwide discussion on the existence of God. Yeah. I have to drop this line in. In an interview, I think in 2009, 2008, a few years after the God delusion, he said, my goal for the God delusion, it would cause a great worldwide mass conversion to atheism. He said, I must confess that's failed. It was a noble goal, but it didn't happen. So he had to acknowledge that what he'd hoped for the God delusion hadn't quite happened. Atheist Anthony Flew, who we saw earlier, stunned the philosophical world when he announced he had come to believe that God did exist. What he did was, he did speak to some Christian scholars. He debated William Lane Craig and Gary Habermas about the resurrection, etc. Yeah, but he'd been willing to follow where the evidence led. So, and that's the book he did write. The new atheist thought he was an old man selling out before he died. But he said science began mounting a philosophically compelling vision of a rational universe that sprang from a divine mind. There's many other quotes. And this particular worldview I now find to be the soundest philosophical explanation of a multitude of phenomena. So Anthony Flew was willing to delve deep and look at all that. And when he looked at DNA, he said, there's no way this could have just happened out of time, matter and chance. He said, can't be. And he became to believe that there was a divine mind. He was fascinated by the resurrection, but I don't think he actually became a Christian, as we might say. So a Christian response has been, as we move toward an end, philosophical naturalism is not a scientific position, but a philosophical assumption. The new atheists are assuming their philosophical position is affirmed by science, therefore conferring on them the authority to declare all supernatural realities do not exist. Their faith is centred in their underlying assumptions, which is philosophical naturalism. So they said science can't prove that God exists, therefore he probably doesn't. Religion is man-made, fanaticism, etc. shows religion is a detriment to society. Atheism alone makes a true human progress possible without superstitious influences. That's their underlying assumptions. Anyway, we'll keep moving, but this guy, Richardson, wrote a book in 1947 on Christian apologetics, and he's saying that, he's just saying that you can have a philosophical view, however remarkable, etc., but the broadest categories of science when applied cannot be validated by scientific methods. Your philosophical view can't be validated by scientific methods. They can never be more than analogies when they are applied to society or the universe as a whole. So the new atheists are not stretching their thinking wide enough. So while they claim it's nothing more than myth and superstition, their own foundations of scientific naturalism cannot be finally proved by the very science to which they look to affirm their views. And the Christians also said the claim God does not exist needs an argument to support it. Fanatical behaviour of religious believers does not constitute evidence that God actually doesn't exist. That's how people carry on, but it doesn't mean God's not there. Religious belief offers insights that help give people a sense of meaning and values that helps make sense of their world and their worldview. Okay, I don't want to go on too long. When it comes to faith, this is a theologian, New Dictionary of Theology. People understand the sour note in faith. Having faith in coping with the real world, he said, faith has poor press. Many people regard it as simple-mindedness and an expression of an uncritical spirit, inappropriate to men and women coming of age. And that is how many people see faith. And one of the problems is fideism, where people have faith without looking to any evidence to support their beliefs, and that is played right into the hands of the new atheists, right? Christian assertions are a matter of blind belief and cannot be known or demonstrated to be true. So when Christians have that kind of view, that's what the new atheists are at war against. Guys from Feinberg say, ontologically, it is correct to accept the Bible by faith. If it's God's word, then it is final authority, you can accept it by faith. Let's keep moving. So ontologically, that's correct, but epistemologically, it's incorrect. If God exists and is spoken through the Bible, yes, the believer is correct ontologically to believe it. But the real question to be answered is, how do we know God has spoken in the Bible? That is the epistemological question, and it cannot be answered by a simple appeal to faith. So some people in the church need to lift their game, as we will see as we draw to a close. Guys have said the crucial thing is belief that and belief in. Beliefs are not knowledge. The crucial issue is that belief statements are not a justification for what you believe, they are an affirmation of what you believe. Beliefs are not knowledge, they must be justified before they can be known to be true. The issue focuses around the difference between belief in and belief that. One may believe in the Bible as the Word of God, but to believe that the Bible is the Word of God requires evidence. I like Norman Geisler. I work with his son. Belief that and belief in. The new atheists cannot believe in God because they cannot believe that any evidence supports his existence. That's the crucial thing right there. We're coming to a close. Avoidance and engagement. Many have accused the new atheists of not engaging with scholars, but many Christians have avoided that same engagement. And that's part of the problem. We can press on. But believers are not the hook. Aiken and Talassi say, if one holds that religious beliefs are not a matter of evidence but of faith, one must give reasons for that belief. Our call for engagement with reasons and evidence of those with whom one disagrees is not out of place. Even if those who regard certain of their religious beliefs as not subject to rational evaluation, he's saying Christians must engage and give reasons, and they're looking for engagement. They're looking for engagement from Christians. Come on. Dawkins has a point. Carl F. Henry. Theology must of necessity declare which method or methods of knowing it considers appropriate to the knowledge of God, and what tests for truth it approves. when a non-Christian asks, well, what persuasive reasons do you have for believing? The basic issue at stake is theology credible? So he's brilliant. He wrote his 6 volumes, God, Revelation and Authority, and he was saying back in 1976 the church needs to be engaging. Had a massive impact on evangelical. Henry holds the biblical revelation is indeed rational and propositional, holding a proposition to be as a verbal statement that is either true or false. It is rational, it is a rational declaration capable of either being believed, doubted or denied. So you can engage with it. In brief, the Bible is propositional revelation. The Christian revelation can be depicted as meaningful, objective, intelligent disclosure. The realm of religious thought and experience needs today to be reconnected with the idea of logical thinking and with a new regard for consistency and the rules of warranted evidence. And he was saying that in 1979. Coming to an end. Only a few more left. Schaeffer's warning. I'll read this in full because I think he's right. Christians have tended to despise the concept of philosophy. True or false? True.
Well, not amongst us, Mom.
No.
It has been one of the things that has been a dilemma within the evangelical Orthodox Christianity. We have been proud in despising philosophy, and we've been exceedingly proud in despising the intellectual. Our theological seminaries hardly ever relate their theology to philosophy, and specifically to current philosophy. Thus, men and women go out from their theological seminaries not knowing how to relate it. It is not that they do not know the answers, he said in his observation, is they graduate without knowing the questions. And of course, William Lane Craig said you cannot do good philosophy without good philosophy. Did I say that right? You cannot do good theology without doing good philosophy. I said that into a letter to him. He said, Bruce, I agree with you. You can't do good theology without good philosophy. I didn't dare tell him that I got it off him. But anyway, he was good. So these guys send us out a challenge as we conclude. Put simply, by engaging with those who disagree with us, which the new atheists hadn't done, we gain a better command of our own beliefs. We come to be in possession of our beliefs. By engaging in disagreement with others, we come to know what we believe. If we care about our beliefs, we should seek out intelligent opposition to them. So that's almost a call from atheist philosophers for Christian thinkers, Christian philosophers and Christian apologists to rise up and be able to engage. And the final thing, that's Dr. Brian Traynor, who Kevin mentioned. In one of the classes upstairs one Monday night, he said what he often said, he called it Trainer's solution. I put it in my thesis too. We should all become seekers and servants of truth. The idea of truth is too important, too life-giving to be abandoned. We Christians should study philosophy to reinvigorate the quest for truth at the highest level, because literally lives are at stake. And that was Brian, that was Trainer's solution, which I always wrote down and put it in. So look, that concludes tonight's presentation, only 1 minute over. I didn't go into a full defence of supernaturalism, or we would be here for another 3 hours. And I'd have to get Kevin to present most of it. So I hope that was of interest and sort of gave us a little understanding that Christians cannot afford not to engage. We can afford to operate with a no reasonable opposition. We must be willing to listen, to hear and to engage intelligently. And there are atheists and others who are willing to hear, to test their own beliefs. Here endeth the lesson.
Right. As I exercise my privilege of power, first question. What is faith?
Well, we know the biblical one. Assurance, confidence of things you can't see, which adds substance to what you can't see. We were talking about that with science. Intuition, a sort of a knowing.
Right.
But then faith
Do
has...
you agree with the definitions that the new atheists use for faith?
I don't seem to regard it as... No, I don't. You've got to have the object of your faith to have faith in that object. Otherwise, what are you having faith in? Whatever it may be.
We have faith the chair will hold us up.
Yeah,
Chair.
Yeah, all right. Well, one definition of faith is trust, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like you look at a chair, you examine it, and you've been sitting on chairs for ages, and you think, I think I'll sit on the chair. I'll actually trust it to hold my weight. So it's putting into action what you believe on the basis of evidence.
Mm-hmm.
That is the definition of faith that I prefer.
I've sat on a few chairs that failed me.
Yeah. But like you could also say it's like using a parachute. You can examine a parachute and you go through all the theory and you say, I think this will safely allow me to jump out of the plane and land on the ground without getting killed. But the act of faith is to actually jump out of that plane and put your trust in that parachute. So, so that is kind of a faith based on evidence. Yes.
What about the idea that business of sitting on a chair is faith? I heard that in Sunday school and I thought that was silly. What about if I came up behind Perry, she's standing up and I'm sitting down, Perry, I'll put a chair up behind you, sit down. That's faith. That's the faith of, in religious things that we're asking people to believe. Not that the sun's going to come up tomorrow.
Well, then it would be my experience of you and whether I believe
That's right.
that you would have put that chair there or whether you were just having an enemy.
But what about if I was just doing it to prove a point?
Can I say that Hebrews 11, from a biblical point of view, Hebrews 11 is probably the real definition that if we want to assume to be Christians, and we have to turn to Hebrews 11, which, among other things, says it's the, how does it start off? It's the believing things not seen.
And faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the substance of things not seen.
But the whole of Hebrews 11 lists all the heroes of faith
It does.
and what they did.
Abraham as he was then, left the land wherever he was and went believing that God was calling him somewhere without knowing what was going to happen. He believed something, was promised something would happen, but he never ever saw it himself, did he?
No.
He lived in a tent as I guess a stranger in Canaan, knowing that the promised land, but it wasn't going to be for him.
I believe in electrons. I've never seen an electron. I
But
believe
there's still evidence for it.
Well, what was Abraham's evidence? Because Abraham had some evidence, it's just not scientific type evidence. It's a different epistemology, different source, way of knowing.
Yeah, God appeared to him, didn't he?
Yeah, so he trusted his experience of God, I guess.
That's incorrect. That's what happened. Yeah.
In our definition of faith, what does it mean by the substance of things not seen? What is that substance?
I think that substance, I was thinking of during the week, I think that substance is the sort of reality in the capacity of a human being to believe. There's a substance to his believing. It's not just wishful thinking, it's not just imagination, it's not just hopeful. There's an actual substance, a capacity that he believes. Human beings have a capacity to believe, whether it's natural or religious or some such. Human beings have that capacity to believe, as we're talking about the chairs.
You mean the ability to believe?
Yeah.
That's the substance of the things not seen.
I think it's a good question.
A grounding.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
But Noah, of course, and he's one of the other heroes of faith that comes out, his evidence only came after he'd done the act. The ark was built, all put together, and it wasn't. I don't see Russell Crowe's example of it, but in the end, the evidence was there, but it was post the act of his.
But again, he trusted his experience. He heard from God, and he trusted that he'd heard from God.
Yes, you're right.
So he didn't get it from nowhere.
No, that's good.
Unlike Perry's experience, it's Noah had nothing to lose. That, perhaps 100 years of labour, that's about all.
Well, that's a fair bit.
That's a the art didn't come about, but Perry had quite a bit to lose if I hadn't put a chair there.
Well, I don't know. I think 100 years of labour is up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's mocked. I'm
And
sure
you-
it's mocked.
And at public humiliation, you'd look a bit of a fool.
You would.
Sure would.
I think it's kind of the faith in the person that what that person has said will actually exist and be. So in the case of Noah, it was faith in God. He trusted God, but if God says something that's true, so therefore I go on that basis. And then afterwards, you saw the result that God was true. Same in Abraham's case. It's the belief that what you are told does have substance.
Yeah.
What Dawkins says, though, is it believing something without the evidence?
Yeah.
Well, that's Mark Twain.
I get to see sort of faith that a lot of people probably don't get to see so often. Because I'm a young earth creationist and I'm out there with it, I get a lot of opposition. And there's one kind of interesting opposition. There are a lot of people who actually believe everything about young earth creationism. They've thought about it, they think the Bible must be true. And yet they still won't believe it. They know what it says, they know why they should believe it, they know it's important to their Christian position. But when the tacks are really down, they won't believe it. They won't put themselves where they ought to be if they did believe it. Because there's too much opposition around. For their career, for their... What's that thing you said a while ago? Their
Status.
Yeah, their status. They will not get off the fence and say, I actually believe God made everything.
My experience with this business of requiring evidence, my experience with in debating in magazines is that those who don't want to believe will not look, and they'll make a concerted effort to suppress the evidence. And whereas if you actually look at a true scientific approach, as if you're an archaeologist and you're fossicking through the dirt and all that sort of thing, you go to enormous efforts to find evidence and value it highly. Whereas a lot of the people who say that Christianity is all rubbish, they do their most to suppress it and to deny that it's there. Which is not a very scientific attitude at all.
I saw on that line, it was beautiful, it was a video, it was a documentary about the ancient world and Old Testament. And you know, somewhere when the Israelites wanted to get their knives sharpened, their sickles, they went down to Palestinians and they sharpened it and they had a pin, and nobody knew what pin was. And this archaeologist was walking along and he picked up this pebble, looked at it, he turned it over, and there's written on it, pin.
In English?
No, not English. There's a real McCoy in whatever language. Pin.
Yeah.
And it was a stone they used to weigh things compared to. I thought, so that fitted in well. The stone is scratching around on it.
Yeah.
The idea that faith is based on evidence raises the question of how much evidence. Because the idea is there that if you have lots and lots of evidence, then there's no room left for faith at all.
And
So you've got this strange idea that you have to have some evidence, but not too much evidence. So the faith is actually the bit that the evidence doesn't go all the way. The faith is the extra bit that's missing.
Well, you're saying that that's, faith is a leap beyond the evidence. I challenge that concept.
Otherwise, then the argument that if you have lots of evidence, there's no room for faith, wouldn't stand.
But that's assuming that faith is not based on evidence, isn't it?
It could be based
Because, like, how much faith do you need to sit on a chair? How much faith do you need to hop on a plane? How much faith do you need to drive a car and put your foot on the brake? At some point, you can't prove any of those things will be true.
And there are examples where chairs have failed, planes have crashed,
Yeah.
and brakes have failed.
But,
So it's not a complete amount of evidence in any of those
but
cases.
still, you have enough confidence to act.
You may not have complete certainty, but there's enough evidence to sufficient warrant to place your faith. And it all depends too on what you're placing your faith in and what it's calling you to do.
Faith doesn't make rational sense. In the end, I would want to take faith back to a relationship.
Yeah, well, that's trusting in the person.
Because
Yeah.
there's flaws with faith Like, if you act recklessly, you sit in this chair, I might be really overweight, and I could act recklessly. I'm still exercising faith, but it's completely no basis because I'm just being careless.
Yeah, well,
that's not faith either.
Like,
is it faith, for example, to believe that someone or yourself is going to be healed from cancer and then you die? Is that faith in the sense of was the substance there or not? Because it didn't happen. Is that faith?
Probably is faith, but misplaced faith.
Yeah.
I saw a little documentary on the placebo effect the other night, which was very interesting, just as a jump. Sorry.
Yeah. But in what you're saying, if you have so much reason and evidence, that doesn't leave any room for faith. So you're implicitly saying that faith is something that is without reason or evidence. So you're accepting their definition, but I challenge that definition is right at all. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Mutually exclusive.
Not fully.
So you're actually saying faith is the bit that is not based on reason or evidence. You say if you had so much reason or evidence, it kind of pushes out the faith.
I guess I'm putting that argument and saying that argument doesn't actually hold up. I was putting that up to say, well, really, that doesn't make sense either. So I guess I'm agreeing with what you're saying there.
Yeah.
Because you're putting the idea that evidence was important. I'm saying, but evidence is incomplete, and if evidence is complete, you were saying starting off by saying faith is based on evidence. And I'm saying, hold it, that doesn't make sense because if evidence is complete, then you can't have the faith.
Well, that's assuming that faith is acting without or believing without evidence, and I'm challenging that. Now, what you're saying is that you can never have complete evidence.
Yes.
That's true of all of life, isn't it?
Yeah.
But we do have sufficient evidence to say it's common sense to act. Like we all make that decision to get on a plane.
Well, see, what's sufficient for some is not sufficient for others.
No.
Especially when you stop talking about things where their structural integrity can be weighed fairly, measurably, and you start talking about, say, a human relationship. Then faith and the trust that you're going to put in that other person is far more subjective, isn't it? And maybe it's even another level when you start talking about spiritual faith.
See, I think the rational view of faith is wrong. I think faith is actually based on the relationship between a real person called God and a real person, and a person. And the actual evidence is like the framework within that relationship exists, but it's not about the evidence.
What evidence do you have to put any faith in God?
It's a relational thing, which I can't explain.
I bet you could explain it if you tried hard.
Yes.
Is this where what we mentioned about philosophy and Christians had to come to terms to bring Christianity and philosophy together? And I have to admit absolute ignorance of philosophy. I've never even bothered about it. But I'm wondering is this where that happens? That we talk about faith in one sense as relationship, that's Christianity, and then we get into faith about things that we're not even mentioning the object, or we don't even have it, and we're then philosophising about it. You know what I mean? We're off with the fairies where we're talking about having faith in something we can't see, we've never heard of, but we're not off with the fairies when we talk about faith in a relationship, because that's what Christianity is about. Is that what you mean by philosophy? That it goes beyond revealed religion and is now off to some principles that we use that try to...
And philosophy is just looking at the issues of how can we know what is true, and that's epistemology. Looking at what evidence do we have to believe in this or that. So it's looking at how do we know, it's really looking at do we have justifiable, warranted evidence to believe in whatever it might be.
So philosophy does require evidence, not just...
It evaluates. It evaluates.
Yeah, and also, this word epistemology, which is really critical to what we're talking about here, means ways of knowing, or how you know something. And it's about the right kind of knowledge fitting the right kind of thing. So, for example, if you're going to sit on a chair, it's about the structural integrity of the engineering of the chair, right? So that's the right kind of knowledge, is that kind of knowledge. If you're going to have a relationship with another human being, maybe caring about the health, there's some stuff about the physics there, but mainly it's a different kind of knowledge that you need in order to have the evidence as to whether or not it's a good idea to get into a relationship with that person. It's going to be different, you know.
But in terms of philosophy is a wide subject, and there are various areas on it. Like one is the rules of logic. So if it is raining, there are clouds. If there are no clouds, it's not raining, etc. That's the converse of it. And so you can construct rules of logic. That's one area of philosophy. Another is epistemology. How do you know what is true? Another is metaphysics, which is, meta means above physics. We talk about things of identity. So there are lots of areas in it. But basically, philosophy is about thinking.
Yeah.
Whereas science is probably more empirical, where you rely on doing tests.
I went to the Adelaide Uni Philosophy Club just because I was interested in the debate about something. I only went there once, and it was absolutely marvellous. So all the bright ideas and all the lots left me behind. And I went over to one of the fellows afterwards, and I said, in what way does philosophy rely on evidence? What's the need for evidence for what we've been saying? And I just got a stare, just looked, and I left. And that was it. I didn't know whether it was me or whether it was the question was offensive. Something was offensive.
Well, there is a sense in which philosophy doesn't make a lot of use of evidence. It's mainly using the rules of logic.
So this might have been a new idea for this chapter. I feel better, thanks.
Yeah.
So the other word, of course, I'm glad you asked epistemology because it was a big red word up there. I didn't really understand what it meant. Ontological, I should know what it is, but I've forgotten.
It's like being.
The study of being.
Being. So if God is real and His word is absolute truth, then to believe in Him as the absolute being makes sense. But epistemology is looking, okay, fine. But what grounds do you have for believing that the Bible is telling you about this God? I don't know if this is slightly off key, but I finished off my thesis with this. I found a gorgeous article of reprint of C.S. Lewis called The Language of God. And I said, oh, this will be good.
Really?
So, 1970, Erdman's Christ in the Dock, or God in the Dock or something. It's called Language of God. And I applied it to the New Atheist solution, beside believing that and believing in. They want the hard rational science as their explanation. Lewis said there's 3 different types of language. He said there's scientific language. It's 15 degrees below zero. There's ordinary language. Oh, it's freezing. And there's the poetic language. Oh, it's so cold, the owl's feathers are frozen to its spine, or something like that. And each has a different description of the same thing. Science gives you a rational description of it is cold. The ordinary person gives you a description of what it feels to be cold, or that it is cold. And the poetic thing is describing how you feel when you're cold. And all of it is conveying reaction to the truth that it's 15 degrees below zero. So I ended up by saying the new atheists choosing science have gone through the scientific description, and there's all these other languages they could experience. And I said, maybe the tragedy is they're just not listening. That's sort of how
If you don't, can I, you know what we talked about before, about the...
Oh,
is that all right for me to use as an example? We were talking about near-death experiences, and because I've been at a couple of deathbeds before, and I found it to be a spiritual experience, and Phil was saying, but what I was looking at, the evidence there was looking at, could be seen as just the demise of the brain and this and that and the other thing, and I sort of see what you've just said relating to that. It's like, yeah, okay, but then it's also, there's also something else going on there, you know?
Yeah, that's right.
think we're done.
Not with that.
We may not be. Sorry. With what's all the role of all the arguments for existence of God, like cosmological argument, design argument, moral argument, ontological argument, etc. I remember involved with the debate with Laurie Eddy, and I presented 5 arguments for the existence of God, and the first thing he did when he got up, he probably listened to me on this too, was there is no evidence. In those arguments we're actually presenting a mixture of logic and evidence of why there are sound reasons to believe in God. I think these guys don't really want to look at that.
Having said that, I reflect on our first few months of lectures where we did go through William Lane Craig's books and looked at them, and we actually honestly looked at each other and said, would that convince me? And I guess for many of us, we said, well, it's almost too theoretical. It probably wouldn't be something I'd use if I talked to my neighbour or someone else I've just bumped into, because it's so, that's the right word, it's so theoretical that it would necessarily, esoteric, that's a good word, it would not be very convincing.
It's answering questions people don't ask.
That's right, exactly. So, whereas there are others, I mean, the fine-tuning argument, talking with someone with science background, fine-tuning argument, yeah, right down.
Well, I think there's, like when we actually did it the first time, I think we were inexperienced. And I think you can actually simplify these arguments down so that you can actually state them in simple terms that do relate. So just because they come across as esoteric may not be the fault of the argument, it may be our fault in terms of the way we actually present it.
And the context in which we were doing it, it was a bit more appropriate to be more esoteric in that context.
Be interesting if we did it again, whether we put it any more convincingly.
Well, I intend that we do.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's been suggested that we should actually redo those ongoing topics because we are reasonable faith.
I picked up 3 books recently that are all pretty much the same. They were all printed in yellow covers. Two of them were children who were Christians who had death experience, a real death experience. One of the children was only dead for about 10 minutes. The other one was dead for about 3 months or something. And the other one, the third one was
been
about...
buried then?
No, they were kept alive on machinery.
Okay. You do sometimes have to define
They were
it.
in coma and showing no signs of life for 3 months.
Coma, yeah.
And the third one was a woman who was much older who had a death experience as well. And the whole 3 of them gave remarkably parallel stories of what heaven was like. The little lad who was only dead for about 10 minutes, he had some other experiences following that where he made some more visits to heaven, but they were all very brief. And yet he talked about his visits to heaven like they were a year or 2 long. There was just no comparison in time between the time he was out from the earth and the experiences he came back with from heaven. They were of learning lessons for years. And the supernatural answers they had to situations all around them were absolutely amazing. One little boy said he met his sister and his mother said, that's strange, you shouldn't say things like that. And he said, no, I mean my sister with black hair, not my sister with the red hair. And she suddenly realised he was talking about someone else that she had a miscarriage. And the family hadn't talked about it to this boy at all. He knew nothing of it. But he'd been there and met his sister. And there's incidents like that that go on and on through the book. And they make a very powerful statement of reality of it all. First, the family around them quite quickly realised that this was real. And while they put up lots of questions and thought about it a great deal, it was obvious it was real all the time. And I was talking with a person about it, and he said, I'm not that interested in it, but I I've got a niece who is, and he then talked to her about it, and she wanted these books, so she came to me and requested all 3 books. She wanted the whole lot, and she ran off with them, and it had a huge impact on her. Huge impact. There are some people who have incredible experiences with God that are evidence that's very, very real. And while God doesn't choose to do that with all of us, we can respect that He does do it to some. And it's wonderful to check them out. Wonderful.
Well, not every person has either the time, ability or inclination to kind of study all the philosophical arguments. Sorry?
That's what you were saying before. Willfully don't want to know.
No.
Well, there was also,
But I
like, if
willfully
there,
don't
you've
want to
got,
know about lots of beautiful things.
yeah.
You know, like I willfully don't want to know about mathematics, you know, which was a source of frustration with my teachers for a number of years. But there's a lot of other things that I can learn about. So how do we say, okay, this area of learning is something that you're a bad person if you don't want to know about it, you know?
Like if you're a young mum with young children, you're probably not going to come along to this meeting, are
I go to a play group and
you? Yeah.
very not interested in anything other than how children grow up.
Well, doesn't that seem fairly fair enough?
It's a whole new world you walk into when you walk into the play group. You learn about little children again.
Bruce, can I ask a different question, going in a different direction?
Yep.
So with the New Atheists and that flurry of books that came out in the middle of the last decade, is it what's the impact in the future? Should we all still be reading the How to Answer Back the Dawkins type books, or is it over now?
I think Alistair McGrath said in 2011, in the second book he did, what's next for the New Atheists? And some reporters too also said, oh, the shine is coming off Richard Dawkins, because people are starting to get these responses, and he himself admitted it didn't achieve what he'd hoped. So as far as I can tell, there was a book out in 2012, but I think it's starting to settle down now.
So what's the long term? I mean, you said that it sparked up these conversations, but beyond that, what can we anticipate? Is
one thing I think to be aware of is whether Richard Dawkins has the shine or not. A lot of people still agree with those views. They still, whether it's
I think the long-term effect has been to become respectable. Atheism is really great stuff, because Richard Dawkins said so, and he's a great scientist. And that's what it may not be true.
He's not a-
That's what people believe.
He's not a great scientist.
No, I'm not saying he is, but that's what.
I thought he was
that's
quite
the
good in
argument.
his particular field.
Yes, it's the pecking habits of chickens.
Really? Well, when you
Yeah,
put it
that's
like
what he
that.
did his PhD on. That's where all his journal papers are on. It's on the pecking habits of
But
chickens.
didn't you write some other books about the selfish gene or
yeah,
something?
he did.
Yeah, but they're not the topic of his research. They're kind of books for the public domain.
Okay.
But they're about evolution.
And he never read the philosophy that he needed.
So you mean they're not that good?
Well, his area of actual research is not particularly profound. So
Yeah.
he's not one of those Nobel Prize winning scientists.
No.
That's like Albert Einstein. He did his PhD on capillary action of
Yeah.
water going up little tubes.
Yeah.
It was way below his ability, but that's what he started out to do.
Yeah.
Because I've read Richard Dawkins, and I mean, I'm no way, I can't judge that because I'm ignorant compared to him. But I've been absolutely profoundly influenced by what he says, and the meaning of life, and the origin of it all, how it all keeps going. And I think, just jump in there, I think the church, particularly the Catholic Church, is going to do enough damage to itself. Even the Holy See, or whatever they call it, is talking about the possible collapse of the Catholic Church. They've lost so much money and so many people over this pedophile business. And that was one of the things that the church had as the high ground. You know, we can speak about morality, but we've got God and all the rest of it. And now they're doing things that even atheists wouldn't do.
Oh, they do. Atheists do too.
No, they don't protect the
yeah, they do.
atheists. No. We've got it in the Holy See. They're doing that.
One of the things they don't like mentioning is people like Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, North Korea, all the things that have been done in the name of atheism. And they say, oh yes, but most of us are not like those extremists, we're moderate. Remember about the problem with the moderates?
Well, some people brought up Hitler was an atheist, but Hitler wasn't an atheist.
Obviously he was. He was based on Nietzsche. Nietzsche, the God is dead guy, was the foundation from which he came.
He saw himself as a Messiah, and as a glorious thing for the Third Reich, and it came from superior people.
No, it was evolution. It was about the master race being the ultimate evolutionary thing of human progression. It was based on Darwin progression.
Partly, but what seems true to me.
It is a spiritual.
But no, if you look at the Wehrmacht guys, they retained the old World War I motto on their belt buckle, which has got God with us. But the SS had taken that off completely, and the SS were known, the pure Nazis were known to go into desecrated churches because they wanted to wipe it out. So the pure Nazis were definitely anti-religion. Just read about what the SS did.
I thought they were a bit occultic.
They were. Oh yeah.
Well, that's not non-religion. That's just dodgy religion.
Maybe, but certainly they were not Christian.
No, they weren't Christians. They had a basically, I don't know the proper word, but it's like a spiritual view on history, where it was going.
Maybe,
which is not science.
No. But certainly, as I say, SS were known to desecrate churches.
They certainly dressed it up with science, all the racial theories were supposedly scientific.
It's coming back to one of the areas where you kind of started off, looking at how the new atheists were particularly driven by religious atrocities, in particular the 11/9, to put it in that way of putting it, attacks in America. How do you, or how should we, differentiate between religion, as in all religions put together, so that we can say there's a difference that they, in a way that they can understand?
One is to do what William Lane Craig and that are doing, is to be able to make a reasonable case for why you believe what you believe. And the other thing is to have lives that match what you claim to believe, to have a living testimony to your life that actually is not, that matches what you claim. And that is where
it's the life.
That's faith. That sounds like faith as well.
But it's the life, it's the evidence of your life transformed by faith that is the best answer to anyone.
Sometimes though, when it comes to that stuff, I want to say, if you want to judge, you want to judge the effect of Christianity in my life, don't just look at where I am now, look at where I was before. You know?
By the way, speaking about 9/11, 1 week ago now, it's 9/11.
Yeah.
So just remind, 13 years in 1 week's time.
and hasn't the world changed since?
What's that?
1 week's time, it's 9/11 anniversary.
Oh yeah.
It'll be the 11th of September, the 11th of the 9th month.
Oh yeah, well it was, it was totally full on and everything. But as we're often reminded by Christian charities, that many people die every day of atrocities. You know.
Yeah.
But not in America.
Yeah, that's right.
Not from a plane flying to a building.
Yeah, okay, that was a pretty good television, wasn't it? Yeah.
I think in the general public's mind, you put together September 11, Richard Dawkins and
Beheadings.
the Catholic Church, and it's had a massive effect on just people's general outlook on religion.
Absolutely.
But didn't they think the same of Pol Pot killing fields? Why didn't they think the same about atheists and killing fields? Yeah, well, I mean, I ask, do they think about Rick Gulag Archipelago and think this is militant materialism? Why don't they think that about that?
People feel betrayed by religion that goes bad, because religion or thereabouts is supposed to adhere to a higher moral standard.
Yes.
When that is missed, then people feel betrayed
Yes.
and have the reaction. They expected more.
It has to be
And that's
question. If you read Peter Hitchens' book, Rage Against Christianity,
Rage Against God.
Rage Against God, he actually spent time in Soviet Russia and was influenced by that, and it was a lot to do with that why he became a Christian.
Okay.
So he did see it.
I think, I think that when we look at which mob is more evil, they're all evil, really.
Only the human ones.
With the beheading thing, and my television's not working at the moment. I need some clever person to come and make it work. But anyway, but I've heard from people about what's happening with ISIS. But I know a group of Burmese refugees, and this one woman who I believe she tells me the truth. I've known her for 7 years, travelled with her. And she said that when they were peasants back in Burma, soldiers would come, and she remembers one time particularly, but they were always brutal. One time they cut off a villager's head, and they kept the villagers had to keep their family member's head until the next time the soldier came. Otherwise, they'd cut off someone else's head. Right? Now, the only thing going on there was that they were coming to get rice and whatever else they felt like getting at the time. So the cutting off of the head had no ideological purpose at all. Right? The head cutter offer was Buddhist, and the head cutter offee was Christian. But it wasn't about religious ideology, actually. It was just about human depravity and power. Right? And beneath the religious veneer, I imagine that's pretty much what's going on with this Westerner who's gone off to some place that'll let him cut people's heads off. You know? Yeah, but we never hear about this Burmese villager, right? You know, this sort of brutality goes on. It's just a matter of when we get told about it.
I mean, it's a fact. I'm sorry. I'm going to say, when Christians are oppressed, it's not really big news.
Well, it's Christians that are having their heads cut off right now, isn't it?
No, they're secular journalists.
Oh, are they? Okay.
Yeah. It's the journalists. When the journalists
well, I think
there's a last fortnight ago I blew up a bit because people were saying about all the refugees. I said, what about the Sudanese refugees who were persecuted 20 years ago? The West basically ignored them. As soon as Muslims were oppressed in Bosnia, it was a big deal. We had to do something about it. We were ignoring the folks down in southern Sudan. Not our problem.
Oh yeah, I think some of that goes on, but and it's the same with the. But what my point about the head chopping off of the soldiers, what I was talking about before, is that it's not. That's not actually. You could use it as evidence that Buddhism is bad and Christians are good, but there's no point in that because it's not about that actually. It's just about sinful humans.
It's the fall.
It could be about power because that's how in the concentration camps they used to have all the Jews and whatever else were in there, and they all had a hat to wear, and in the morning they had to come out and parade around with their hats and all this. Anyone who didn't have his hat was taken out immediately and executed. And so what some of the guards would do is the night before they come along with everyone knowing, take one of the fellows' hats and leave it to them. And you can imagine how much sleep they got at night trying to keep hold of their hats. That's terrorism. That's power.
As is what I was talking about. And so I don't know that terrorism. I think people can use. I'm no fan of the Muslim religion, but what I'm saying is I think that really it's just that sometimes these brutal people are just using it as an excuse.
No, I disagree there. I'd like to always go back to look at the individuals who started that particular faith. Muhammad truly was a guy who practiced by force. He initially was very, what's the right word, when he started in Mecca, his visions were not well accepted and he was oppressed, and the first series of his, I may stand corrected by those who know Islam, were largely peaceful and get on with people, and indeed even pretend you're not a Muslim if you hesitate to survive. When he moved to Medina, He then became far more successful, a lot more people believed him, became strong. He then went back and conquered Mecca, and among other things, raided caravans, etc. And he was basically by the sword.
Yeah, yep. And the
So-
Quran also says
Yeah.
to go and kill people at the
That's
end, right?
But you go to Jesus Christ and his followers up till the reign of Constantine, with sometimes a reasonable peace. They were a minority who were oppressed.
Yeah, okay, but we can't really say, look, it's only other religions that cause violence
But
and
the
ignore
basic,
the Middle Ages.
The original teaching, the original teaching of the teacher was one of, my kingdom is not of this world. Islam, yes, we want a caliphate, and that's what it's about. And there is a difference.
Yeah, I accept what you're saying, but there's also stuff in the Old Testament where violence was sanctioned.
It was.
Yes.
And I still don't know what to do with a lot of that.
Yeah. Sorry?
Yeah, and I still don't know. I still don't know how to deal with that. I don't know how to work that out.
Well, you have to wait until Leonard Long comes on the last night of this year to
Okay.
answer it for you.
That's good.
Okay.
I have read a few books already, and I'm still going, yeah, okay, but.
Some societies on the earth, those atrocities are very unlikely to happen, but they do. And people don't get away with it. And other societies on the earth, the people who perform these atrocities can in fact get away with it.
But and I'll just mention the other thing. We know that the Israelites actually followed the Molech, where you would pass your children through the fire. In other words, you perform child sacrifices. God previously said to Abraham, these people haven't done their fulfillment. And made God's judgment on people who were killing their own children. Had to wait till that he was really angry with them. Because if you kill your own children, then that's a pretty good place
Yeah,
to
I know,
start.
and I do get that. All right, so I've read, and more or less I accept those arguments, but I have to say, not completely. You know.
I've done a lot of comparing the New Guinea culture with the Australian culture because for many years I had New Guinea people coming down from New Guinea and staying with us and studying and had contact with a lot of them, and I knew missionaries who were in Papua New Guinea back the other way. And I was making comparisons between Australian culture and society and population with that one up there. And they're fundamentally different. Christians are a real minority there, but there's a lawlessness in Papua New Guinea which is very, very basic in their culture. When one guy came down to stay with me, we went out and filled up with petrol, and we stopped at the Bowels room and filled the tank up, and then we grabbed our money and we went inside and we paid for it. And we came back out, jumped in the car and off we went. And he just couldn't believe it. He said, how can your society work where people can come in onto the street, fill their car with petrol and just take off without paying for it? There's no policeman here to watch you that you're behaving yourself. If you decided to go off without paying, there's nothing that poor guy in the cash register could do about it. He's only an 18-year-old looking after the place for the evening. How can your society work? In my country, you could never do that. The place would be locked up at night. You wouldn't be able to get petrol. But if it was open, there'd be a guy with a gun there looking after it too.
Like big states where you actually have to prepay because it's American society for you because that's what happens there.
And there are societies on our earth where law is in control. It doesn't have to be Christianity, but Christianity jolly helps. And I've read more recently that when a society gets 10% of their population to become Christian, the society actually changes for the better. 10% of Christians is enough to tip them over. And China is moving that way right now, folks. In a few years, there'll be 10% Christians in China.
Well, that's good.
And China is going to change its whole personality if they get beyond 10% Christian in their population.
10% in a population is seen as a critical mass.
Yeah.
And someone said the Muslim one was about 1.5 or something in Australia. But in 10%, the Muslim one in France reached critical mass, and they've had a few dramas over there.
Yeah.
But that's the critical mass level.
All right, I think we have gone long enough. So thank you very much